So I can't hear. Hello, everybody. Bonjour, comment ça va? I'm Therese Edwards. I'm phoning in and speaking to you today from the beautiful Ghana lands. So I'd like to pay my respects for all First Nations women, leaders and emerging that may be listening today. I'm from Adelaide and I am so excited to be amongst like-minded people and to enjoy speaking about how critical it is to speak out, even if your voice is feeling a little bit wobbly or your knees are a little bit uncertain. And I want to talk to you about a really compelling case that I led in Australia, and it was around women who head up their family, often doing all of the unpaid care, all the juggling, single mums, often without the financial resources, always short on time and sometimes unsafe. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I am got every finger and toes crossed that this is going to work out. And it's not working for me. I will just get some technical help here. I apologize for those who are sitting and listening. My presentation is not sharing, so I'm sure you can imagine those nerves and that horrible feeling when that happens. But I will start talking while that is happening. So I wanted to talk a little bit about single mothers in Australia, and I'd like you to think and reflect upon the single mothers that live in your country. So in Australia, we had a really bad policy approach to single mothers. There was a decision not to provide single mothers with any sort of financial assistance. So this was since 1940s. Since 1940, all right, we've got some problems with my PowerPoint because I did upload it and send it, but they don't have it. So my apologies. So you've just got me for the 20 minutes unless something magical can happen. So with single mother families in Australia, unfortunately for most of the women, they could not have access to any financial support from the 1940s through to the 1970s. So the Australian process and approach was to take the babies from young women. Often they were coerced, forced, culturally they were forced, emotionally they were forced, and economically they were forced. So women signed over their babies to be adopted. In Australia, we had a very influential news magazine and newspaper. Pre-social media, that was the influence. And it was very pro giving up your baby to a two-parent family. Women faced judgment. They were deemed as inadequate mothers. And also their families would come under shame if the woman kept her baby. So I have met some of the most amazing and heroic women who decided to keep their babies in the 1960s and the 1970s. And they fought really hard for change. And the first piece of change came when all women who had babies could get access to a payment. And that then allowed them to keep their babies equal footing with women who were perhaps on a pension, women who were widows. And that started to change our culture in Australia. And from that, women started to be able to juggle going back to study, perhaps juggling going back to work. And so it was amazing. The horror of women losing their babies became known through an Australian inquiry in 2012, where our Prime Minister made a formal apology. I personally worked with women who had been affected, whether it was the adult baby or the women who had given birth. So I was very close and understood the trauma. Some women didn't live long enough to see the apology. Some women took their own lives after having their babies taken from them. So it was a really transformative time in Australia. And we'd had this great culture where we called it our safety net, where people across all spectrums of our community, if they needed support, they had a safety net. I must admit it was a very low paid safety net, and often women were still living in poverty. But that was our culture. Then we had a change in philosophy around 2006, and the government that came in, very much what we would call neoliberal philosophies, which is not looking at the system, putting the blame upon people's shoulders, putting obstacles in place, making it harder and harder and harder for for women to juggle. And I do use really gendered language because that's the reality. In Australia, most of single parent families are women, and still most of the people who provide that really tough unpaid care are women, and most of the people who pay the formal care, such as in aged care or in childcare, are also women. So I do really use gendered language. In 2006, there was a change, and there was a statement and policy made that said if your child was now 6, we expect you to get ready to go back to school, go back to work, because your child is going back to school, and we will also cut your payment. So on the 1st of July 2006, any new people coming in, any new women coming in to claim Social Security, they could not get the payment, a parenting payment, if their child was older than 6. The rules kept in place and they got fiercer and fiercer. And in 2013, if everybody, so that was people who were already in receipt of payment, they lost their payment. So on the 1st of January 2013, in Australia, 85,000 single mother families were plunged into poverty. And I want you to think about how Australia is one of the more richer countries. We are prosperous. We've never been this mean-spirited to women before, and we could certainly afford the payment. So it was much more than money. So this is where I really want to share with you. So I head up a not-for-profit organisation with a long, rich history, very small, but we had done everything in our power to change the minds and hearts of our policymakers. And we had women who were living in poverty who were quite prepared to speak. So single mothers spoke to the media, they appeared in the media, they appeared with me in parliamentary inquiries, they protested. We used every domestic avenue that was available to us. After that, that did not make a difference to our policy. We could not make that change. So what we did is we then wrote to the United Nations, and I wrote the complaint. And if you're ever wanting to support women to use our international framework, you need a victim, which means that it's a person who's been harmed by the policy, and you need an author, which is myself. So I wrote a 20-page complaint. I had support. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a human rights lawyer either. So I got some legal advice from Professor Beth Goldblatt, who's in Australia, who could help me a little bit with the technical side. So we wrote our complaint and I lodged it. It just was through email, lodged it. And then I think it was a few months later, I received receipt of the complaint. Now for me, it was significant because Australia had not had United Nations before ever looking at a complaint. So when we got the email back to say that they had looked at the complaint, that was fantastic. And the process was that the United Nations would go to our, what they call the state party, which is our Prime Minister, our Minister, our governing bodies. And of course, they were wanting the complaint dismissed, and then they would come back to me and I would provide additional information. So this went on for a couple of years. And then we get to 2019, and in United Nations, the topic for the Convention on the Status for Women was social protections. So we decided to go to the United Nations. So we put in a request to speak. We got that request approved. I had done enough work with the United Nations to have a work relationship with then the Special Rapporteur of Poverty. So he joined us, and then we fundraised, and this is the magic moment. We fundraised to ensure that the woman who was the victim of our complaint, the woman who was living in poverty, had enough money to fly from Australia to New York, to stay in New York, because it was where the presentation was. And she was part of our group, and we got to speak. The other incredible things, and I'm so sorry my PowerPoint is not here because I was going to show you this, is we did live media crosses back to Australia. So we were the lead show for our news, for current affairs shows, and we did a lot of radio interviews. So what we did is we got the matter put back on the table for women living in poverty by claiming our place, by allowing women to speak, by making space for women who were living in poverty. Of course, roll forward, that did not make a change. And then we had a change in government in 2022, and I got appointed onto the Women's Economic Equality Task Force. 13 women across Australia were appointed, and we got to talk about what were the key issues, what would make the biggest difference for women, what locks women out of even getting a foothold, what stops them from studying, what stops them from getting part-time work. And of course, it's resources. It's resources and structures. Poverty traps so much potential. So we wanted to unlock that. We wanted women to be able to live with dignity, for their children to have the opportunities to stop poverty from becoming an intergenerational curse. We also knew that violence, gender-based violence, actually lives and lives comfortably with poverty. So it is a cause and a contributor to poverty. So we had this fantastic opportunity and worked really hard, same process. We had a presentation. We went to Parliament House. I was able to put on a presentation. We had enough money to fund 4 women to fly into our Parliament House, which sits in Canberra. And the women that were in Canberra were women that had lived in poverty, so they'd never been on the plane before. So we went to Canberra, we gave a presentation to the members of Parliament. We got great support, we got in the media, and we worked hard and hard and hard. And then we got the news several months later, about 3 months later, we got the news that the government was going to actually make a law change in our social security, and women would be enabled back onto that fantastic payment. So myself, what I also would have shared with you is our Prime Minister from Australia making that announcement, where he acknowledges the work of the chair of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, also a professor, and also myself are working really hard. So we got that change made, and it was wonderful. So it came into effect in 2023, and my latest figures that I can tell you as I present to you in March in 2025 is that 100,000 families across Australia were lifted out of poverty because of that work. And 17% of that 100,000 families were our First Nations women, who have so many additional hurdles in terms of structure, racism, poverty, violence. So we made this amazing change, and we did it because we had women who were prepared, despite their circumstances of living in poverty, were prepared to speak. They were prepared to speak in the media, which is really vulnerable and very hard. You imagine giving a presentation virtual and those nerves behind the scene, especially with my presentation not being available. We'll multiply that by women who do not have that political and social agency and also face discrimination. So they were the real heroes in this story. And that is the message that I wanted to leave with everyone. That sense of stepping up, of claiming your space, of not listening to anyone who has a judgment of you or who believes that you should not be part of the story, part of the policy discussion, part of change. So if I can leave everyone with one message today, and that is to reclaim your seat, make sure you have your space because your voice is valid. So I thank you so much for listening to me. I understand that I have 5 minutes left for questions, so please feel free to ask. And if not, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to my host for such a beautiful introduction and warmly inviting me to your stage. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.